Good morning, everyone. First, I wish to thank, on behalf of my panel members, Facilitate, for having us for this discussion over the next 40 minutes or so. I am thrilled to be here. I think this is my 7th year in a row, and so much has changed in respect of advanced therapies. So I think this will really be a wonderful week, and kicking it off with the Investment Summit today is really a wonderful group of panel members. So I'm going to ask each of the panelists to introduce themselves and their firms, and we'll start with Shyam.
All right, you're mixing it up. I thought you were going to start on that side. So hi, I'm Shyam Patel. I'm with California Institute for Regenerative Medicine, CIRM. And so for those who don't know, CIRM is a unique experiment of the state of California. We're a state government agency that's founded and funded by the people of California. We have $8.5 billion in funding to accelerate the development of cell and gene therapies and regenerative medicine more broadly. So to give you an idea of what that means, we funded over 120 clinical trials to date. And right now we have an active portfolio over 250 projects that we are supporting, spanning everything from early discovery through late stage clinical trials. And because of the fact that we fund this really innovative, very evolving space of regenerative medicine, particularly cell and gene therapies, we're constantly evolving our programs to meet the needs of the field. So to give you an example of that, a couple of weeks ago, our team got approval to launch a brand new program called RAPID. It's a $100 million funding program that's designed to advance platform-based genetic therapies for rare diseases. And the goal here is to advance more safe and effective therapies to rare disease patients more quickly. And I'm happy to talk a lot more about all these things as we move forward here.
Thank you, Shyam.
Great. Good morning. Eric Shiozaki. I'm a partner at Revelation Partners. We're a healthcare dedicated secondaries investment fund out of the Bay Area. Secondaries within biotech, I'd say, are fairly new. I'd say that we're on the leading edge of introducing secondaries as an alternative financing strategy for not just companies, but for venture funds and for corporates as well. And I'm sure that we'll get into some of the details here.
Great. Thanks, Eric. Brad?
Excellent. I'm Brad Sitko. I'm Chief Investment Officer at Zoma Royalty. We are a publicly listed company on NASDAQ, ticker XOMA, about a $500 million market cap. We're a biotech royalty aggregator. So we buy future at-risk payments for partnerships that exist, generally focused on clinical stages. So anything from preclinical through proof of concept, even phase 3 assets that we'll acquire. We've put together a portfolio now of about 140 assets, and generally deploy about $5 to up to $50 million per transaction. Oftentimes the capital is used for companies to help them get from one inflection point to another in a way without adding additional share count and diluting their equity shareholders. My background before that was at RTW Investments, where I was heading structured finance and alternatives. Prior to that, was an operator in a healthcare IT company in the genomics space, doing a restructuring. Was on Wall Street, and then strategy consulting for the life sciences.
Thank you, Brad. Sure. Vinny?
Thanks, Michael. I'm Vinny Jindal. I'm the co-founder and CEO of a company called Therapeutics. We're a private clinical stage company developing a very unique cell type called the neonatal cardiac progenitor cell. It's a stem cell found in the heart that we derive from neonates, babies under 30 days old, who have a congenital heart defect and require life-saving open heart surgery within the first 30 days of life. Is that not on?
That's straight.
Okay. Well, you guys were all lucky. None of you had to hear me say anything for the last 20 seconds. So I'm Vinny Jindal. I'm the CEO and co-founder of a company called Therapeutics. And we're developing the neonatal cardiac progenitor cell. It's a stem cell found in the heart that is actually, there's tissue excised about 1,000 times a year in the United States when a neonate, a baby under 30 days old, has to have life-saving open heart surgery. We rescue that tissue, we process it, we purify the cardiac progenitor cell, which is proven to solve a lot of the manufacturing issues historically related to the development and manufacturing of adult stem cells, and of course avoids a lot of the overhang related to embryonic or fetal stem cells, because these babies are born. We're a clinical stage company. We're moving into actually a pivotal study this year to treat cardiomyopathy and Duchenne muscular dystrophy. My background is as a scientist. I successfully dropped out of 2 PhD programs, both times leaving for Wall Street, and was a biotech equity analyst on the sell side and the buy side. Ultimately went in-house 10 years ago, was the head of strategy at a company called Riata, and then the CFO at a company local to here called Reneo through its IPO in 2022.
Thank you, Vinny. Josh?
Good morning, everyone. I'm Josh House. I'm a managing director with Healthcare Royalty. I cover the West Coast for the firm. We kind of break the world up geographically, so have responsibility for sourcing and execution of transactions with West Coast counterparties. Healthcare Royalty is a private equity firm. We focus exclusively in therapeutics and make investments in royalty and credit structures. Check sizes between 50 and kind of 500 million and growing upwards. And we focus almost exclusively on products and opportunities at this phase 3 data and later stage. Thanks, Michael, for having us.
Thanks. Thank you all. So start with our first question. I'm going to ask Shyam regarding CIRM and its mission to describe your mission in a little bit more detail and how you work together with other funding sources, investment firms in advancing innovation, and whether that is specific to California or outside of California as well.
Great, thank you. So as I mentioned, we're a grant funding agency. So the way we fund is to give out grants, and we do that through a number of programs that span discovery, clinical development, and clinical development. So the company comes in with this project at whichever stage is appropriate, gets funded for that stage, and then can access CIRM funding for later stages as well. And so in that sense, we funded various different projects and companies all the way from candidate discovery through multiple clinical trials. A wonderful example of that is Neurona Therapeutics, where we started off funding a lot of their really basic biology research at UCSF, and then candidate development through Neurona, as well as 2 of their trials right now. And many of you know that Neurona is one of the companies that's been very successful at raising venture investment. And so they've raised $200 million in venture investment in addition to tens of millions of dollars they've gotten from CIRM. And so they're leveraging both of those funding streams to advance their projects. And when things were lean, it was CIRM's funding that got them through advancing their clinical trial. And as they were generating more clinical trial data, they were able to go back and raise additional funding. And so that's sort of the interplay that Michael's referring to between grant funding as well as investment. So for us, it's really common to see companies coming in, and we see term sheets where the term sheet says it's contingent upon getting CIRM funding. And so by securing CIRM funding, they can then secure their next round. And then the milestones for both the CIRM award as well as their investment are usually aligned because we're both looking at regulatory inflection points as well as clinical data. And so in that sense, if a company is really planning to leverage both non-dilutive funding as well as venture investment or alternative funding mechanisms, it's best to do so when times are not super lean, where you're getting grant funding to maybe extend your runway rather than sort of when your runway is mostly out and you're getting grant funding, because in that sense, it's going to be difficult to just use grant funding by itself to get to your clinical milestones or your preclinical milestones. And so in that sense, think about grant funding as an additional lever that you can pull. It's especially important at the seed stage, but it could also be useful at the clinical stage when you have Series A, B, C rounds, because it might help you get additional capital to keep a project going.
And regarding geography, is CIRM's mandate specific to California?
It is, and like any good government agency, we made it really complicated. And so if you're a California organization, whether you're a company or an academic, you can get CIRM funding, and you can use that CIRM funding to do your operations wherever they may be. So you could have a manufacturing CDMO that's outside of the country even. You could have your CRO be wherever it needs to be. You could have clinical sites spread across the country. However, if you're a non-California company looking to get CIRM funding, we'll only fund clinical trial research. We'll only fund the part that's in California. However, when you do that, you could do your manufacturing wherever and get your California patients paid for. So in that sense, it's better to be a California org. But if you're a non-California org running a trial in California, you can use our funding for that as well.
Great. Thank you, Shyam. Let's see, for Brad and for Josh, specifically as it relates to royalty finance or revenue interest finance, can you speak a little bit about both pre-commercialization, post-commercialization? I think your strategies, one aligns with both, and one would align more with a commercial strategy or a company that has commercialized a product, medical product or device. Can you comment on when the appropriate time is for a company to think about revenue interest financing and some of the key requirements, metrics, covenants from your organizations?
Sure, I'm happy to start, and then, all right, we're in business. I'm happy to start and then turn it over to Josh to wrap up for it. I think just taking a giant step back, like when is non-dilutive, or to be really clear, it's differently dilutive financing valuable, right? You're economically diluting rather than diluting by adding more shares or slices of the pie. And I think what's really critical in when to think about non-dilutive or less dilutive financing to your company's story is when you have an inflection point in mind and you're not going to get the value of it, or you don't have the equity investors around the table that are going to allow you to capture the value of that inflection point appropriately. We've all just come through what feels like a nuclear winter in terms of a funding environment. And there were times when capital availability felt really slim. So this is a situation where you can raise 10, 15, 20, 50, depending on what your situation is, of differently dilutive capital into the capital story. And the way to think about it is, when people look at royalty finance, they often say, well, it feels more expensive than like debt, or it feels different than equity. And the way to think about it is you're focusing the economic dilution on a single product or a couple of products that are at risk, time-bound, have binary events attached to them, and let's be candid, across the industry, more likely than not to fail. So if you're willing to think about sharing the reward in a way that's aligned with you, that's something when you can think about like a royalty, revenue interest financing, a royalty monetization, because you're giving yourself the freedom you need to operate without having a new board member appear, without having a first lien across all assets of the company. And then you can decide and run the company through to that next inflection point, and hopefully, knock wood, see a positive data event or clinical data happen where you can capture that value in your next equity round.
I think I'll answer maybe the question kind of directly, and maybe a couple categories. On the debt side, I think you see pretty good venture debt availability, kind of even starting as early as phase 2. I think a lot of times that kind of depends on who your shareholders are and that kind of thing. So I think the kind of considerations that go into that are probably different than the royalty. On the royalty side, we should be clear whether we're talking about a passive monetization, which I think that's reasonably available kind of starting in the phase 3 stage of development, on kind of a revenue interest financing where the company that's selling the royalty is doing the development and planning to do the commercialization. That market is a lot less liquid in kind of the phase 3, the project financing stage of development, and there are kind of one handful of parties who do those. that is very different once you have data, and there are probably a dozen or more firms who do that. So I think once a company starts to get within shouting distance of a phase 3 data readout is probably the right time that we would start engaging. I think you're seeing more and more companies get interested in non-equity financing kind of earlier and earlier. There's not an amazing availability of those just yet, but I think it's the right time to start getting smart on these once you are starting to think about your TPP and designing a phase 3 study for, commercial considerations, et cetera.
Thank you both. Vinny, so congratulations first off as you're moving toward pivotal trials in cardiomyopathy. So congratulations in that regard. And as the representative for innovative companies and innovation, how do you think about equity, venture debt, royalty, synthetic, in this case, a synthetic royalty monetization? What are some of the metrics and your own experience from your history in this regard?
Yeah, no, it's a great question. Something I'm sure all the entrepreneurs here are thinking about. What's the right place and time for dilutive versus non-dilutive capital, or differently, dilutive capital. I think that my view on it is just very consistent with what the market will bear. We heard from our colleagues here that a company has to hit a certain degree of maturation in its fundamental programs, line of sight to producing these very exotic things that few biotech companies do, like revenue, profit, things like that. So the closer we get to that, it becomes a more appropriate instrument. And where, naturally, I think as an entrepreneur, you're less willing to take the dilution to fund risk because, at that point, you're just funding later stage economics, and that you'll have the capacity to pay that back through revenue and profit. So, my view on it is those products are wonderful. And I would say that the royalty is a little bit later. Venture debt may come a little sooner, as you have sort of more proof from a phase 2 that you can get across the goal line. And I think early on, nobody likes dilution, but it plays a role, Having the really kind of well-regarded healthcare investors who've done diligence on you, signal to the market that, hey, quote unquote, smart money is in. It's not just, the next round of investors who care. Big pharma, if your intent is to partner or to get acquired, looks at who your investors are. They sort of take that as a proxy. There are other ways to accomplish that, of course. I mean, if CIRM is willing to give you a grant, we've applied for CIRM grants before, so I can tell you how exhaustive their process is. It's world experts opining on your technology and program and prospects. That has its own signaling value. But I think early on, it's really good to sell equity, get the brand name investors in, take the dilution, and then think more carefully about the role of dilution as you go forward, knowing that you won't put your company at risk because you have line of sight to profit.
Great, thank you, Vinny. And Eric, just maybe as a corollary to some of the comments that we've heard, how do you think about investing in companies where the capital stack might also include either an existing royalty interest, a synthetic royalty interest to a royalty fund, CIRM funding, and venture and/or venture debt? How do you think about that in terms of your own investment approach and mandate?
Yeah, so in the secondaries world, we don't run into many companies that have done a royalty deal. And maybe I'll just give spend 60 seconds on secondaries, and I'll start with a story here. So generally, a secondaries investor will come in and buy shares from an existing shareholder. That existing shareholder could be a founder, could be current or former management, or an employee, or a venture fund that had invested. You might be seeing headlines every week about OpenAI, SpaceX, Anthropic doing billion-dollar secondaries. These are employees of these companies secretaries selling millions of dollars of shares in these private companies. That's the easiest explanation of what secondaries is. Now, you don't see that in biotech. I can't recall the last time I've seen a secondaries advertised like that, right? But those are tender offer secondaries. Where secondaries in biotech are valuable is when there's largely a hole in the cap table. So picture yourself CEO of a biotech startup. You've raised equity capital from the marquee VCs and even some corporates. But there comes a point in time where one or two of those folks, maybe more, all of a sudden don't have money to continue to finance the company going forward. And as we all know, biotechs need capital to continue as a going concern, right? So you're a CEO, you realize it's still pretty hard to raise capital out there, but now I've even got to backfill my syndicate. What do I do? Well, that's a great example of where secondaries come into play, right? It might even be a situation where there's a term sheet, but there's a pay to play in it. So if I'm an existing shareholder in that company and I don't do my pro rata, my $1 per share value goes down to 10 cents, let's say. Well, there's 90 cents of arbitrage in there that can be used to entice a secondary investor to come in. Now, why would you want somebody else to come into your cap table, basically an uninvited guest, if you will, to your dinner party halfway through? Well, that uninvited guest brings capital as well. So if you had a strategic or a brand name investor who's not investing, what does that signal to the market? Well, you've got somebody coming in who's going to plug that hole and bring fresh capital along with it. And so I'd say in terms of secondaries, they sit somewhere between a granting agency and the royalty folks. So the types of companies that are generally availing themselves of secondaries are going to be, I'd say, within 12 months of the clinic or in the clinic.
Great. Thank you, Eric. Question regarding that we hear from clients on a fairly regular basis, and during our preparatory discussions, this same topic came up, and that is, does a royalty monetization in and of itself, or an interest ultimately in the revenue of a product candidate or an existing product, does that represent a poison pill to an acquirer, or for that matter, we didn't discuss this necessarily, subsequent financial investment? So how should we think about that in terms of the presence in the capital structure? Does it represent a poison pill essentially, or a stumbling block to a strategic transaction or further financial investment?
I think, Michael, it's a great question, something people battle with a lot. I think more than anything, it's emotional rather than factual. And it's emotional because people think that it's going to chill, like a process or a sale process, because there might be a 15% royalty stack or something like that. But the truth is, a strategic, if they're interested in a product or a program because it fulfills an unmet need in the market and they believe it has commercial potential, will buy a company or license a product regardless of the existing royalty stack. And the other thing that we're starting to see more and more is strategics coming in and actually buying percentages of royalties that they would otherwise owe. Like AstraZeneca recently went out to Compugen and acquired part of their royalty stack back for $65 million. So there's always a way, and I think it's often used as a red herring. That being said, like, we're conscious when we're structuring something with a company that you don't put the company in that situation where they're thinking about, well, what would the burden of a 20% royalty be? Like, there's kind of that magic number around the 10 to 12 to 14%. That's a fine spot for a company to end up in if they're selling a synthetic royalty interest.
Great. So Josh, you're going to give us the bright line. What is the number, the tipping point, percentage royalty interest that is either a pill or not? That one number.
It's probably 10%, frankly. We have this discussion all the time with management teams who are convinced that this is going to be a an encumbrance on a potential M&A transaction, which I'm not here to argue that. I think we have tools in our toolkit that allow for a buyback in those kind of scenarios. And so I think it's a bit of a red herring. But I agree. I think kind of once you start getting into the double digits, it maybe gets a little uncomfortable, especially if the company's going to be standalone and wants to be profitable, et cetera, et cetera. So I don't think that is a concern that management teams should place kind of 1, 2, or 3 on the list, frankly.
I'm just going to see if I could add something here. Just taking a step back, I think one of the things to appreciate is that a lot of these alternative funding mechanisms that are being discussed up here, I think, are an example of how the biotech industry is maturing and how we think about financing it going forward. So I would make the argument that none of the financing strategies or mechanisms that are being discussed up here, whether it's equity, debt, royalty, partnerships, secondaries, are that innovative. If you look at sectors and industries outside of biotech, they're being used, right? It's just that biotech has been very unique in that it's very technical, very science heavy. A lot of technical folks in this field who maybe don't come with a finance first mentality, which is very, very fine, right? But these are instruments that are used elsewhere to finance businesses, and biotech is a business. And so I think, as we progress another 5 or 10 years, we're going to realize that many of these mechanisms will become much more commonplace. When I first got into venture 20 years ago, royalties really weren't in existence, right? And they've come about. One point in my career, I was doing these defined exit deals with Blackstone, right? Those weren't being done. Right? I mean, what debt lender would lend money to a biotech? There's no cash flows to pay off the debt, right? But it's done, right? So there are many ways to finance a biotech beyond your traditional Series A, Series B equity financing, right? The Metzeras of the world are great, but those are the outliers, right? And even IPOs themselves are not really liquidity events; they're financing events for companies. Right, so I say all this just to keep things in perspective, right? A lot of this sounds exotic, but 5 years from now, we're going to be talking about it like it's old hat.
These are great points, thank you, which triggers a corollary question, I think, for all of the panel members, which is, you talked about defined exit transactions of the Blackstone Abingworth days. You didn't mention Abingworth.
Well, yeah, so
now
we partner with Abingworth on those things, right. So I should have given them a plug.
So return profile, cash on cash return or IRR, how do we think about that? And I want to ask Serm too, or Sham, from Serm's vantage, whether their return metrics are important, also how you're monitoring your grantees, something we didn't talk about in the prep, but I'm curious about that, and I think the audience would be curious about that. So cash-on-cash return requirements and or IRR, how do we think about that? And then would love to hear about CERM as well in that regard. Who wants to start?
This is state secret, Michael. Like, this is the secret, special sauce. We don't do project financings, phase 3 financings, but we've looked at some. I think the return profile there looks like an IRR that's kind of definitely north of 20 and maybe closer to 30 with a multiple in the 3 to 4 range. Starts to look pretty equity-like.
Multiple of 3 or 4?
3 to 4.
Okay.
In the royalty monetization world, I think the answer is it depends. Launching products, IRRs in the teens, multiple in the 2 zip code. A launched mature product, IRRs can come in, south of 10% for a blockbuster with a very well-defined revenue trajectory in the hands of a platinum marketer. Multiple there, kind of in the mid 1s, 1.5. So.
Great, thank you, Josh. Who would like to? Yeah, Brad, go ahead.
So we look at our model is really much more venture-like. So we talk about venture-like returns, and unlike some of what Josh was mentioning, we don't have a cap on our return because ultimately we expect that many of the assets in the portfolio can become a zero, and that's okay, and that's part of the model. It's almost like being a Series A investor in venture capital, right? You're looking at what is going to create the outsized return in the portfolio, and it's often things that you don't expect. That said, I think what Josh was mentioning from my experience is absolutely correct. That's what you're seeing. And I think where the disconnect often happens in the market is someone who has seen say a royalty pharma deal that is a platinum marketer on a mega blockbuster product, and it prices at somewhere like an 8% cost of capital, and thinks that every asset should price at an 8% cost of capital. So oftentimes our job is about education and awareness of a market that many people don't understand yet. To Eric's point, there were 20 years ago, there were a handful of deals done. There was maybe 5 or 6 royalty deals a year. Now, 5 to 6% of all capital raised in biotech is through royalty or structured finance transactions. So it's having its day.
Yeah. And Vinny, we talked a little bit about your more recent experience, and you have experience over 20 plus years, I think, in all of these areas of finance and from different vantage points. We talked about venture debt in particular, but do you think about, as a CEO, do you think about cost of capital right now in your, call it pre-pivotal stage of development, or how do you think about cost of capital?
Yeah, I would say that relative to my peers, we don't think in as much a sophisticated sense about IRR, particularly coming out of the last 4 years where it was more like capital, please. It's been such tough sledding. So those calculations, I'd say, are a little bit less, I'd say they're secondary to the sort of temporal considerations, and the other check boxes you need to hit along the way. But I think Eric made a great point. These instruments are getting discussed in boardrooms earlier and earlier in development than I've ever seen. And so, sorry to answer a question with a question, but I'll ask my colleagues here. So for the entrepreneurs in the audience who are now starting to think about this a little bit earlier on in development, what are the guidance points? Watch out for this. Make sure you ask that we can all make sure that we check those boxes during a process.
Shyam, do you want to do that and also maybe answer the question from the CIRM perspective on returns?
Sure. So I'll answer the latter first. So for us as a government funding agency, the primary objective is for that project to advance to its regulatory milestones. And so in that sense, we're looking at capital efficiency and executing on those. And so in several instances, what we've seen is that if projects are moving faster, let's say we probably had an award that had an end goal of a pre-IND meeting. If you're time and resource and capital efficient, we may be able to stretch those CIRM dollars to get you to IND. And that's happening in quite a few of our programs where they're able to get to IND, where initially the goal was just to get to pre-IND by stretching those CIRM dollars. And some of those have also been able to, some companies have been able to leverage that additional ability to use CIRM funding to get to IND to raise additional capital from partners or from investors to help get to that milestone. Now, in terms of, many of us are California taxpayers in this audience, what's the return on all this money that CIRM is putting out? So we have a revenue sharing arrangement. So all the CIRM grants that go out the door, if there's commercialization down the road, a percentage of that is owed back to the state of California as a royalty payment. And there's a unique aspect to that is that the state of California has to reserve those funds that come back from the revenue sharing to actually help patients in California access those same therapies. And so in that sense, it's basically a way to increase patient access and affordability for those therapies that CIRM helped get to the market. We try to also make sure that that doesn't become a poison pill, as has been mentioned before. And so part of that is a company can actually buy us out effectively by converting the award to a loan prior to getting BLA approval. And in that sense, they pay back the loan. And of course, as you might expect, the interest payment on that scales based on the maturity of that project.
Great. Thank you, Shim. That's really helpful. Let's see. We are almost 5 minutes, so want to make sure that we allow for Q&A from the audience. I don't know, Eric, did you have anything that you wanted to comment on based on this last topic before?
I'll just add, cost of capital for secondary is usually somewhere between venture and I'd say the royalty debt space. So IRR would be in the high teens, and multiples on these things, these funds would be like 2, 1.5. It just depends where you're investing in secondaries. Maybe to answer Vinny's question about what to look out for, for me, it's not a specific thing, but I think it applies to every operator, every founder, CEO, regardless of who you're talking to on this stage or off the stage, but to view every capital partner as you would a spouse, right? These are literally marriages that you're getting into. You can't easily unwind them, right? These are generally irreversible contracts, if you will. And we know that biotech is not a straight line, right? It's a roller coaster. And so you can have the best laid plans, but things are going to get tough, maybe more than once. And you want to make sure that you've got capital partners that are going to be able to have the stomach for that as well and be flexible to work with you.
Great. Thank you. Thank you to all the panel members. I think we're going to take questions from, Chris.
What we got?
One question, okay.
Anybody? Way back.
Thank you. This is probably more for the royalty folks on stage, so Brad and Josh, but how do you think about royalty investing in cell therapy, particularly the autologous products that have had a more challenging gross margin profile relative to more traditional products over the years? Because I'd assume that, you get paid no matter what the margin profile is of the product or the company, but, of course you want the company to do well and the product to do well. So I just curious your thoughts on how you think about investing in that space where the margin profile is less attractive.
So I can tell we've looked at a number of opportunities, certainly in the cell therapy space. And one of the things I would say, it's less about what is the margin profile, because I think in many products there's ample margin to be able to use non-dilutive financing as a source. I think the one thing that we focus on a lot, especially with cell therapies, is the scalability of it and the ultimate logistics in terms of getting it from a prescription into a patient. And many of the companies and many of the processes have challenging journeys. And that's where we probably spend the most of our time on the diligence to understand how does it commercially scale. And there's often a disconnect between what the company believes and what the grizzled experience has taught us as to how the adoption curves look or what peak sales potential is. And many of the cell therapy companies that I've talked to, I would say there's often a disconnect in people believing that total addressable market and peak sales are interchangeable. And that's the part where you have to kind of recalibrate expectations. But it's certainly not the margin profile, it's actually more of the commercial or the distribution profile.
Can I ask a follow-up to that real quick? Sorry, Josh. What would be a threshold for annual sales or sales ramp-up or peak sales that you'd be looking at for an advanced therapy like cell or gene therapies?
I hate to give the answer of it depends, but it depends, which is it depends, are you really meeting an unmet need? I think that's what it comes down to. And you could find that's where you have less margin for error in the forecasting, but as long as it's priced appropriately to take into account the risk and a smaller peak sales number, whether it's 100 million, 200 million, like that's probably a reasonable threshold for the it depends question.
Yeah, we don't have any bright line rules on your question. I think to the audience member's question, I think it's a good one. You're not trying to hang a royalty on a company in a way that kind of puts them into financial distress. I think, again, cell therapies, a royalty in the single digits, that should not be an issue. I personally, and I have a little bit of a background in cell therapy, I think those can be interesting areas for folks like us because those products are very hard to genericize and they have a lot of duration, which is very attractive for firms like Healthcare Royalty. And so I think that's kind of an interesting space. But you're not wrong that we do kind of have those discussions internally. It's not the margin profile of a small molecule, and so you need to watch that.
Great. Thank you. And we'll wish everyone a good day and a good week at ATW. Thank you all.